And just while we're waiting, for those that don't know this tool, the chat window is very useful because you can chat to everyone or you can chat to someone privately. You can choose from the menu there of who you chat to. And there's also a speaker view and a gallery view in the upper right-hand corner for tuning in to seeing people. And the gallery view has actually a couple of options, bigger and smaller, and so we like it better than Skype or other.
Way better than Skype. Skype has been going downhill consistently.
Indeed that.
Okay. Welcome, Reed.
Hey, y'all. Getting my video set up with some battery. Hold on one second.
And we may have some more people jumping on as well, but they'll kind of just integrate into the conversation as it flows. So Jeff just mentioned the chat. There's on the bottom of the Zoom window, you should see a chat icon, and that lets you send a message to everyone, and that's everyone that's in the room that you're in. Right now we're in I think they call it the main room, is that right? Or the main meeting room. But we can also do breakout rooms and get people into smaller conversations of 3 or 4 people. And if you send a chat message while you are in a breakout room, only the people in the breakout room will be able to hear it. So, and we may end up making use of breakout rooms on this call. Hello, Evo.
Hi.
Welcome. Okay, just a heads up for everybody. We are recording this conversation. There's a couple of other things. If you go into Manage Participants, or I think down below you should not manage participants, but participants. Do you see a hand raise icon? No. Anybody? Yes. If you click that, you can raise your hand. Yep, I see Jeff raised his hand. Hi, Francine. So just practice that. And then if you click it again, you can lower your hand. And we can try to run this a little bit. We can take votes. We can do some polling stuff with that. We may end up creating a bit of a queue. That's a useful tool as well. Okay, so we'll get started. So the prompt for this, and I'm actually just going to go back to Facebook on my end so that I can read it, was basically, and this is not the only thing we can talk about today, but it was just kind of to give us a little bit of a starting point. The prompt was essentially based on this Wired article that was sharing this work from a professor from, I think, UC Irvine, focused on this interface theory of perception. Did any of you get a chance to read the Wired article or the actual full paper, which was like 20 pages long? And I'm going to step a little closer to my internet because somebody let me know that it was breaking up a bit. Okay. Did anyone get a chance to read the full paper? Raise of hands. Nope. Okay. Did anybody get a chance to read the Wired article?
So Matthew, where did you send out those links?
They were actually in the Facebook. The Facebook event just had a link to the Wired article. But at the bottom of that paper was the link to the full paper at the bottom of the Wired article.
There's also a few Science and Duality, maybe that's the name of that conference, from him a couple of years ago. So if you prefer to hear an audio of that idea, it goes very fast and it's kind of hard to grasp if you're multitasking, but just wanted to give people the heads up on that too.
And I can give my quick summary. I just read the full paper yesterday, and basically the paper says this: hey, in cognitive science, on the theory end of things, a lot of people, most experts, advocate for this view of perception that is our perception, that evolution favors perception that accurately represents reality, right? And that there's this evolutionary pressure towards accurately representing some objective reality that is there in the world. And he criticizes this and lays out a separate, a different worldview where he basically says, no, not so much. They're confusing truth or what is objectively there with useful. And he says, the way that I've framed this for years is that nature chooses useful over true every time. And useful happens in a particular context. And so he lays out the paper is actually pretty fun and funny. There's 2/3 of the way through, he gets into some math, which if you kind of ignore the equations but read the words, makes sense easily. But most of it is some pretty fun examples, including one about these beetles in Australia that are having a really hard time because the males find the name of the paper, by the way, is an interface theory of perception, or the interface theory of perception. And these beetles, male beetles, are attracted to female beetles that are brown and dimpled and large. And it turns out that in Australia, there's a lot of people who like beer, and they like, as he frames it, they like full beer bottles, and they bring those, and then they leave empty beer bottles, and these empty beer bottles look like really large, brown, dimpled things, which the male beetles end up wanting to mate with. And they spend all of their time trying to mate with these beer bottles, and it's actually leading to a huge collapse in the population of those beetles. And he just starts pointing out the ways in which our perceptions don't necessarily reflect reality. This being, the introduction of beer bottles being a new how do I frame it? A new player in the world of the beetle, basically. They had evolved in a context over a really long time where you didn't have to distinguish between beer bottles and actual female beetles, and all of a sudden the beer bottles show up and it's causing a real problem for them. Okay. I'm seeing some chats here. Proposition: perception to objective reality, nature useful is greater than true. Which of the papers, because there were 3. Great. All right. I want to actually open this up to you guys, and we're going to start with just that was sort of a quick summary of what the prompt was, but I'd like to have just a quick, hey, I am blank, and if there's something in particular that you're interested in exploring or you have a question about, maybe that, and we're going to try to keep them brief. Actually, just do the hey, I am blank as the verbal, and then let's type in the chat any question or potential path that we want to explore. I think that'll let us kind of do the complicated stuff in parallel a bit. So, hi, I'm Matthew, and I'm in San Francisco.
Hey, I'm Sam. I'm about 80 minutes north of Seattle.
Hey, I'm Reed. I'm down in Austin, Texas.
I'm Fern, and I'm in Ashland.
I'm Jeff Clearwater, and I'm in Ashland with Fern.
I'm Michael Linton. I'm about 300 miles north on Vancouver Island.
Hi, I'm Francine, and I'm in North County, San Diego.
Hi, I'm Nicholas, and it sounds like I'm right in between Michael and Sam in Vancouver.
Hi, I'm Tapa, and I'm in Austin, Texas.
Hi, I'm Tia. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm Tia, and I'm in San Francisco.
Hi, I'm Evo. I'm in Oakland.
John Kelden, Norrköping, Sweden.
Hi, I am Robert Best. I'm in Toronto, Ontario, Canada.
Matthew, you're on mute.
And do we have any others? I think that might be it. Okay. So take a moment. Let's jot down a couple of thoughts or things that you might be interested in exploring, whether it's about the interface theory of perception, about the MetaCurrency project, or about how those two may relate to one another. Or anything else, if there's other questions you have or comments. And I'm just going to mute folks when they're not speaking. Okay, I'm seeing some really interesting stuff coming in, and I'll start reading these. I actually don't know whether or not the chat stuff shows up in the recorded video. So we've got from Evo, Tragedy of the Commons, Self-Governing Systems and Landed Villages as Labs. From Sam, I am an amateur and founding collaborologist, so very interested in knowledge representation and collaboration, therefore crucially dependent on information flow and transformation. Key in my considerations is the issue of recognition, which is of course dependent on perception. From Evo, Future of Community Ownership in Landed Systems. Fern seconded the Evo's point on self-governing systems. Tia said she's more interested in MetaCurrency, but no real agenda. Happy to be here. Francine said perception, MetaCurrency project. Jeff Clearwater said, want to discuss how our perception of alienation and dog-eat-dog largely dictates our perception of economic relationship and possibility, and how MetaCurrency deprograms that. Michael said, my main interest is networks of agents. Conscious is optional. So networks of agents, conscious is optional. Reed said, implementation with government data toolkits. I think I saw Nicholas giving some sparkle fingers to one of those comments. John Kelden said, reading two books that might be related to this, Alva No, Varieties of Presence, and Wheeler, A More Developed Sign. Nicholas said, what are the implications of these findings for our understanding of rationality? Interesting. Fern said, we could ask people to raise hands for resonance. Yes, that would have been a good point. Thanks, Fern. Tapan said, the philosophy of Ceptr. I think we may try to get into that a bit as well. Evo, she's making an announcement. I found lab for a new lab and eco-village, land for a new lab and eco-village here in Oakland. Questions around how to support fluidity in creating new village models, truer equity in relationship over time, trust. Very interesting. We may get into that as well. I see some raised hands on that one. Sam Hahn says, action, closure, credit, recognition, barter, and currencies is my connection to MetaCurrency. Interesting. And then Evo says, for background, thanks, love your questions. Okay, we may see some more, more ideas, more thoughts, etc. I'm going to start with self-governing systems. It seems like there was a number of those that kind of touched on this. And I just want to sort of throw out there, that's the topic. Any comments about how systems actually can govern themselves and what that process looks like?
Well, I think that would depend on the people that you have who are joining that system, and depending on their developmental level, if we're going to use that word, or what their values and what their cares and concerns are, and what the conditions they are in. It would look different depending on those variety of factors. From my perception, it would.
Thank you, Francine. Sam, I think you were next. And I already, people started raising their hands, which let me know, oh, this person's ready to speak next. And after you've done speaking, please lower your hand so we can keep that kind of clear. Sam.
So I very much am interested in the phenomena and the dynamics of self-governing systems, but at the same time want to recognize that the self-governing systems, if they are emerging as an even perceived or actual threat to existing non-self-governing systems, that initial pressure to disband or worse, to be destroyed, is something that these self-governing systems need to be able to accommodate for. And you can see that everywhere now. And I think unless we deal with that, self-governing systems don't even have a chance. Over.
Jeff. Thank you, Sam.
I just want to recognize that from our work in communities over the years that you can, no matter what you say your governing system is, and it's kind of building on Sam's comment, that it's the emotional and telepathic field of agreements that you already have bringing into a circle that's governing, no matter what you say is governing. And so we see that.
Oh, Jeff.
Saying is that.
Sorry, you cut out for a second, but it may have been on my end. Sorry.
Okay. So basically, that's what Sam is saying, is that you have to recognize the subtle underlying agreement fields. Often they're emotional or spiritual or telepathic or whatever you want to call that. But for us, the highest model of governance is a jazz band, because there's already all sorts of underlying assumptions in the tempo and the key and the feel and the agreement field that we're all going to honor each other's voice. And so for me, the underlying agreement fields are to make those explicit are absolutely.
Sam.
I really want to resonate a lot with Jeff's comments because 2 points. Number one of my most extreme joys is playing string quartets. I don't play jazz band. I used to play jazz band when I was in junior high, but now it's in string quartets. And that real-time interaction, that instant dynamic resonance, that perception of what you need to do or how you need to accommodate, etc. I really get that, and I would love to see that in self-governing systems and in larger groups of more than 4. And just as an aside, I once wrote a blog, I think it was in 2008 or 2006, called Everything I Knew About Management I Learned as an Orchestra Conductor, because I actually conduct orchestras, okay? And so it's a very short blog, but you can search for it. It was published at UC Santa Cruz blogging site called svprojectmanagement.com. But I've gotten a lot of good feedback or interesting feedback and made connections based on that blog. So I really love the idea that Jeff just posed about real-time interaction and self-governing systems and high exemplars of that. Over.
Wonderful. Any other comments on that? Okay. I've got a brief comment I can make there as well. I think that at the end of the day, self-governing from my perspective really has to do with feedback. Well, it requires feedback loops, right? And it requires the individual parts of the system to be able to contribute to the steering. And I think even systems that we don't think of as self-governing, they are at the end of the day, or they become self-governing at some point. If they aren't capable of sensing what is happening in their environment and reacting to that, either they steer themselves, so they self-govern, or they die. So they tend to go away. And that's not to say that how do I frame this? That's not to say that, well, what that can mean is just that it's only once you experience really significant pain that they start to steer, right? And it doesn't mean that they don't experience significant pain. They definitely do. But yeah. Sam, your hand is raised. Is that raised again, or is it still raised from the last time?
Well, I realize it's raised again, but I want to give other people a chance before you come back to me, okay?
Well, yeah, can I get anybody else?
Matt, your room is going to close in 6 minutes. Is that what you planned?
It is not what I am intending, and I am about to enter my credit card information to finish the transaction, because I did notice that. So.
By the way, Matt, I have a paid-for account on Zoom, so if you want me to send a link on that so you don't have to do that, I can share that, okay?
That's okay. I do appreciate it. I'm going to be doing these a lot, so I'll just throw it on there right now.
I see John with his hand up.
Yes.
I'm going to delegate to you guys to moderate as I pay for this. Thank you.
Hey, John, I know you're on mute, by the way, John. Lower left, I think.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Now, Wicked Problems, Horst Rittel, addresses a new angle where you can actually see that struggle between old governance structures and self-governing newer ones. So wicked problems might not be longer seen only as wicked problems, but as actually sort of possible embryonic solution spaces. So, I mean, I will leave you to sort of to delve into wicked problems. It's kind of well researched, well covered, but from a different angle, from the point of self-governing systems, which might be exactly as Matthew should have said, those self-governing systems that are actually sort of already operating. It's kind of a complete turning inside out of reframing of what the wicked problem is. And that would also give the additional benefit of providing to the old stogies, the defenders of the status quo, the old systems holders, right, a way of actually understanding what us on the edge of things are actually doing.
From my perspective, the way I've come to think about this stuff is that I think of it as food, as different organisms eating different foods and transforming those things that they eat, that they take in, their inputs, combining them in different ways, transforming them, and then pooping them out. And they poop out something different from what they took in, usually. Sometimes the only thing that's different is that it's now a different time. They sequestered those things from the environment for a while, and now they're back in the environment. Sometimes they move them from one place to another, and sometimes it's that they transform them entirely. So for instance, one of the things that we take in is oxygen, and one of the things that we output is CO2, right? And so in that way, we are transforming some resources, and that's not just, it's not just those things. We have a whole bunch of other ways in which that stuff gets converted and things that it processes that it does. But from my perspective, it's this. And one of the things I had thought about doing today, and we can try this if we want, but it was to have a little session where we all write on a shared screen, but each of us follows different rules about what we think of as food and what we transform that food into. And so we have a few people that just are emitting E's. They're literally just, they click on the screen, they type an E, and then they click on the screen again, they type another E, and they click on the screen again, they type another E. And so they are putting E's onto the screen, right? And then you have other things that are, when they see two E's, they take those and they delete them, they erase them, and they type an A, or they type an EE, right? And the idea was that those E's would be basically energy from the sun, and you can have other resources that are already on the screen, some H's and some O's, and you have somebody would be assigned, hey, if you see two H's and an O, delete all three of those and type an H2O, right? And then you would have other things that come along, and when they see an H2O and an E, they delete all of them and they create two H's and an O, right? And so you have these different things that are, processes basically, that are taking different sets of inputs, transforming them, and creating an output. And essentially, a year or so ago, I had outlined this concept as a possible game to help people, a game called Food. And the idea was that in playing this game, you would actually get to witness how emergent, complex adaptive systems actually work. Now, there's a couple of pieces that would be interesting there around birth, things giving birth to new copies that maybe play with slightly different rules. They're not a perfect copy, they have some mutation. So birth, death, and mutation, and the ways that those emerge. We've got some other comments.
I'm struck by your digestion metaphor because it is a pre-conscious process. And even Jeff's jazz analogy and improvisation. And I think that this, both of those analogies draw attention to the way in which these findings make us look at collaboration, or even kind of like sharing a field of symbols as non-rational. I don't know where I want to go with that, and I don't want to get too big with it, but I think that we're using different faculties, and I'm interested in whether or not we're trying to heighten our ability to function in this non-rational type of a way, or are we trying to make these patterns explicit and turn them into something rational that we can then work with? What's going on there?
Anybody have a comment on that?
Thinking about flow space, kind of.
Francine. You may be muted. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I just unmuted. Now I lost what Nicholas said.
Rationality.
Now this fits in. I think we develop other senses. We have senses that need to be developed deeper. And they might not be what's normally considered rational, but it is extending more into the field that Jeff was talking about, this energetic structure. And you actually learn how to navigate in that energetic structure differently. And that is what, here I think I'm going to just piggyback a little on what Dan Hoffman was talking about as conscious agents. There's something else, there's some other mechanism that if we step out to it and get to know it, we actually see ourselves as something that is using conscious agentship, if that's a way to say it. So I do think that it's a whole expansion of our senses to be able to reinterpret what we are and what we're experiencing and what we've come to do with each other. I think I'll stop there because I don't know what I'm talking about.
I actually think that last statement, I don't know what I'm talking about, is maybe the most accurate thing we could say according to the findings of this article that we're talking about.
I think I
actually do know what I'm talking about. I just don't know how to discuss it. How's that?
As is so often the case. Did I see a raised hand from Jeff a minute ago?
Oh, I'll pass for now.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, I will pick up on it. I was going to respond to what Nicholas was asking about. What are we doing with that? And I think MetaCurrency, one of the wisdoms of MetaCurrency is that it's based on seeing flows and moving from a object-based perception reality to a flow-based perception reality, and that's the basis of emergent systems, and being able to adapt in a jazz band and to adapt in a circle of people and feel the heart. And so it's a matter of how visible we make those flows. And to me, what's exciting about MetaCurrency is it decommodifies those flows that have been commodified into almost a numerical neurosis that we call the economy. And so for me, the ability to go through life, and it's actually a different perception. The upward spiral is a little teeny video with the worst produced video in the world, but Art Rock loves to share it around, and it actually invites you to go through life perceiving flows rather than objects, and it's a profound change agent in my life and in creating economies and governance systems.
I second both of those points about the Upward Spirals video. It is both the worst produced video of all time and one of the most profound things that you will ever watch. And somebody will. Oh, there we go. Yeah, we've already got. Thank you, Fern, for sharing the link to that in the chat.
Yeah, I want to add to that about the flow systems and how do we make it visible. This word that is one of my favorites in collective intelligence, which is holopticism. And that's what jazz bands have, which is, the capacity to see the whole and the capacity for every individual to then relate to the whole and to organize themselves according to what is happening in the whole. And so jazz bands is perfect because, of course, if you're not listening, you'll be the worst player. But if you're listening, if you're aware of the others, then you can tune your instrument and you can participate and in an incredible manner, in an incredible way. But in our world, we have very little visibility of all these flows. And for us in MetaCurrency, currency comes from that. It's like seeing the current, seeing the flows. And I just imagine that, and to connect to eco-villages, is just how can we create small systems, small ways, small agile ways of seeing those flows within any organism, so that because it's not as obvious for us as the cells, we're not as intelligent. It's a different intelligence, but they do connect to the flows in an incredible way.
And I'm going to jump onto that point and try to tie that specifically back to a main point in Hoffman's paper. The way I see this interface perception of reality is basically that there's evolutionary pressure that favors good enough decision making and action taking over perfect decision making and action taking. And it's because of time, basically, right? If you sit there going, wait, let me get everything, let me get all the information, understand exactly what's going on so I can make the right decision, something else eats the food before you get to, right? And so there's this pressure to be perceptive of at a good enough level that you're able to act. And if you are perceptive of more than that, it actually can inhibit action taking. And so for me, and this kind of, I'm trying to touch on, Fern had talked about an organism, right? And the flows through that organism. Well, it's easy to perceive of a me. I think of me as an entity. I think of the apple as an entity, but there's really something else going on there. There's sunlight and soil and water that flowed into a tree that grew an apple, and that apple got harvested by a farmer as part of some industrial farming complex, probably, that has whole sets of capital and stock markets and other things going on tied to it as well. But somehow that got to a grocery store, and I went to the grocery store and I exchanged some money for that, and I ate it, and now it's inside of me and it's being transformed into muscle tissue or something, right? And there are flows going on there. But we perceive of the objects. We are sort of built to perceive of those objects and have rather than to see the meta layers. And I think one of the insights that the MetaCurrency team and the project kind of is building on is recognition that, yes, you can think of that object as a thing, but you can also think of it as a subpart of a larger thing, or as the ecosystem that some other thing exists within. And there are these sort of layers that all are true, and yet we can focus on the things, or we can focus on the flows. And if we gain the ability to see all of those and have signals about all of those, we can use those signals and those perceptions to help us steer. I saw a raised hand from Sam, I believe.
Yeah, I wanted to at least say what might be obvious here, which is that flows and recognition of flows is obviously central to systemic thinking and systemic modeling. And the other aspect of that I want to draw back to a notion in very simple Cartesian geometry is there's a duality between points and lines. So this kind of maps to me the duality between objects and flows. If you actually reverse all the definitions of each, okay, all the same geometric laws apply. So if you have a object-centric view and you apply laws and try and understand connections between objects, that gives you a certain way of looking at the world. If you look at flows but take the same mathematical theories and reverse them, you still understand objects, okay? So I want to at least give you that little sense that we can transform one way to the other, and they're both useful in actually attaining this more systemic looking at the world, systemic modeling view of the world. There's also actually a related notion I want to bring up here, which is Kirchhoff's law, in E&M. You have to understand in flows which ones obey Kirchhoff's law and which ones don't. This is the conservation of flow. Certain objects will obey conservation. Like you can say, if I send water down a creek, this much volume of water is going to split into tributaries. And there's a kind of a conservation of flow you can model for that. There are different systems where transformation takes place, where objects disappear and become other kinds of objects, and those are sinks and those are sources. And so applying Kirchhoff's law or the conservation law to the wrong flows can lead you astray. And I just want to at least point out that you got to understand which flows observe that and which flows don't. Over.
You're muted, Matthew.
Thank you. Can we hear from somebody who hasn't spoken yet? Any comments, questions, thoughts, new directions for the conversation? And
this is Reed. Can you guys hear me?
yes, we can.
So I'm new to this. Only just in the past week been checking out MetaCurrency project. Just based on what Matthew was saying earlier about looking at these different flows, I'm wondering like how much of it is like a biological thing, you know, like we like to eat apples in the fall, and how you can actually track that kind of stuff versus more of like the big data sort of thing, which is like, you know, like what I mentioned earlier in the questions, like big government stats about like what's going on, how people are spending their money and their wealth at different points in time. So if you're gonna create a system, how do you sort of fuse the psychological and like just human traits of doing things that we do with like the, I guess like the more analytical, like subjective things, like, you know, purchasing power of particular companies and stuff like that.
Michael's raised his hand. Yes, Michael. And you may be muted.
Yeah.
There you are. No, you're good.
The conversation here is a bit like a bunch of individuals trying to become a collective, the we-ness, from the I, the me, to the we. And it just feels contradictory to the very thesis of this paper that you've raised. That what we're looking through is a lens that does not allow us to see what we're trying to find. I'm more with the utility than the truth in this area. I've been watching a flock of birds wheeling outside my window. And you know how the envelope is created basically by one simple rule. Close, but not too close. You know? So I've seen a lot of the sort of collective intelligence movement sort of struggling as a bee to understand the swarm, an ant to know its colony. And it seems a little bit misplaced. Worthy, but misplaced.
Other comments or responses? Sam.
So I can't leave that without asking Michael, so where would we be better focused?
I think in the utility space, I think that functionality and form work together very effectively. I think it is by the process of interactive connections, just like the birds are essentially in communication when they're flying in a flock or a bunch of sheep on the hillside. You know, there is a communication going on. And that's where the currencies, I think, will show up in product, event. There's a concept called reality, events, and agents, REA, that an accounting principle developed by a guy called McCarthy at Michigan State about 30 years ago. And it's got a very good overview. It's like everything in the universe is an agent, and they're in forms of interaction with each other. And you can track those resources flowing between these agents. Those are the events. Me to him, so much of. You know, that's it. And if that's the conversation, then really we just need to watch how that multi-threaded conversation evolves. That I don't know what you've got to look for, Sam, so much as what you've got to do and discover. I think there's one of these from-like things, do it to learn it. Yeah.
Jeff.
Yeah. What Michael's saying, and again, unpacking the jazz analogy, not to beat it to death, but if you unpack it a little bit, what I like about it the most is, you know, in terms of the bee in the relationship with the hive, that moment where a jazz band reaches magic is when the individual is listening absolutely to the collective. And yet the collective is also listening for the moment where they put forward the individual. It's like, it's that when they're handing around that improvisational moment, it's you want to be fully able to express your voice, and you want to be fully supported in that. And yet at the same time, you're not imposing your voice. You're listening for everyone else to invite it. And so that place of dropping ego and yet absolutely upholding each individual, that's that magic point where the bee and the hive are listening for the best for the all, and not compromising either for the other. Just wanted to unpack that a little.
And kind of trying to, I think, tie Reed and Michael's comments together and to try to clarify something. And I love the jazz analogy, but I do think that it's easy for there to be a misunderstanding of what that says or what that means, in that I can see it being that, we just need to be able to perceive all of everything that's going on, which seems fine in a 4-person group, but not so fine in a multiple billion person globe, right? Because there's just too much information there. And that is actually not our worldview on the MetaCurrency project. That's not where we're aiming for. We think that's not possible for you to perceive of everything, nor is it useful, which is kind of the point of the Hoffman paper, right? It's not useful to perceive of everything that's going on. It's actually, he says in the paper that if you really perceive of truth, of what's really going on there's real serious pressure that drives you towards extinction, right? That was the point of his paper. And so framing it a little differently, you can think of these different bits of food, whether that's a drum beat, or an apple, as signals. And they're signals that are being received by an agent, by what we could perceive of as an entity, an organism. And so from its perspective, this is food. Well, you have another organism that's shaped differently that does not perceive of that as food. And that's okay, right? That's fine. They are, as a consequence, they're not competing with one another. But as a result, some agents will be sensitive to some forms of food, and they will be able to transform those and do things with those. And other agents will be sensitive to different forms of food. And at no point will any one of them have a complete perception of all the things that are going on. For me, it was almost surprising, I guess, would be the way to frame it, that this was like, this was non-obvious research in the world of cognitive science. This is a theory that was not mainstream. I feel like this has been such a part of how I see the world for so long, and we've been building on top of these basic ways of seeing the world for such a long time that it feels natural to me at this point to think of these things that way. But the thing that the MetaCurrency project is trying to focus on, at least in one area, at least in the areas where we're focusing on digital tools, is, hey, if we think of these things as signals, and those signals can be taken in and transformed and then published, i.e., eaten, transformed, pooped. If we think of them that way, you have agents within a system able to take in signals, transform them, publish them, and others who are interested in the things that get published will consume those, and not everybody's going to be interested in those. Not everybody's going to have access to those. I may not share that information with everyone, but those signals end up enabling us to self-steer. And Reed had asked about biology. I think biology is a really useful metaphor because it helps. I think it's one of the places where humans are able to perceive of these types of patterns and the ways that they play together and the way that they sort of pan out, right? The kinds of evolutionary pressures that happen. But biology is not the only context in which those types of complex adaptive systems patterns occur, right? They occur in pretty much every context. That just happens to be a really good one that we can look to for storytelling and to help us to more easily see those patterns in play.
It's possible that we're already intuitively tapped into them too, because they're going on inside our bodies. But I don't know if the bridge, that bridge there, and we're sort of breaking up consciousness into knowing and non-knowing, and it might even be a little bit more complicated than that.
There's Nicholas, you mentioned consciousness, so I'm going to indulge. All of this stuff for me has been very closely related to some recent, I don't know, for me they were epiphanies around consciousness. Somebody had commented on some Facebook post a little while ago that, you know, hey, with computer systems, blah, blah, will we see the rise of these artificial intelligence things that would be distributed forms of consciousness? And my comment was, all consciousnesses are distributed, right? Like, we perceive of ourselves as a single entity, but that very perceptual faculty emerges from a whole bunch of other interactions of what we can think of as subparts, right? And if I lose oxygen for, like, I don't know, 20 minutes, if I don't have any oxygen for 20 minutes, that perceptual faculty goes away. It's completely dependent on the presence of one of these components that would be a participant in the generation of that consciousness or that awareness, or that, I think, more useful way of thinking of it, sensitivity, the ability to sense, to, you know, perceive of or receive a signal and then do something with that and then maybe take an action. So for me, that concept of consciousness actually enabled me to divorce consciousness, as you had talked about earlier, Nicholas, from rationality, from humanity even, and enabled me to perceive of consciousness as any interaction or set of dances between two or more entities. And so right now we are in a conversation with, you know, 10 or so of us here. And to an extent, we are dancing together. And there is, each of us as individuals, but there's also this other thing that is the conversation that's happening between us. And that feels pretty abstract and hard to wrap your head around. But I think the simpler example that kind of makes it more easy is, the first time I got into my car, it felt like it was me and my car, and we were very separate. Right? I had seen other people drive a steering wheel, but I had never driven a steering wheel before, and I had my hands on it, and I'd seen people push a gas pedal, but I had never pushed a gas pedal before, and everything was very tenuous, and it felt like we were divorced from one another and separate actors, right? And I was scared. I was scared that I was going to crash this thing. Today, when I drive my car and somebody swerves into my lane, I automatically yank on the steering wheel. It's not even it doesn't require thought in some like aware, conscious way, because I and the car have long since become one. And we've become one because we've danced together for, 15 or 20 years now, right? I have danced with cars for so long that when I get into a car, my body treats it as if it is an extension of me. And that's because with those previous interactions, I would take a type of action and it would respond in the same way. If tomorrow you get in your car and you turn to the right, you pull the wheel to the right and the car doesn't turn, you're going to go, whoa, and stop the car and get out of it, because suddenly the steering wheel is not behaving in the way that you expected. And you're going to go, well, something's wrong here. I'm not going to be able to run on those autopilot things. I can't trust this anymore. And it leads to a breakup of that entity. Anyway, that's sort of a long-winded rant there. I see Sam has a raised hand. And if anybody else has comments or thoughts or like wanting to call bullshit on anything I've said, please raise your hand and participate.
Not bullshit at all. I think that I was hearing what you said triggered me back to this theme of the self-governance idea, which is that self-governance happens when individual vision of what needs to be done or individual sets of things that need to be optimized are more or less non-conflicting in any subsystem or sub-ecosystem. So I act as an individual, but I act in accordance to what I think is best for me. But if I have a conscience or any kind of morality, I act in a way that actually optimizes those things around me as well. And other people do the same. But how far we come to having some shared, if that's even a good thing, notion of what to optimize is dependent on culture, is dependent on all this exchange mechanisms that you're talking about. So to me, I think I wanted to point out, again, this duality between what I think and what I see and how I act as an individual versus what I'm really trying to optimize, both for myself and for those of us together. And that both are necessary because I think that, and by that, I don't mean that they have to be identical. I just mean that there's both objects and both objects are at play. And we have to have approximate ways to match up, what you want versus what I want. But I think if they're identical, that's also dangerous. I wanted to just put that out there. Over.
As it turns out, we are actually probably better at collaborating already, and it's going on. We're involved in it all the time, and our biggest saboteur is our own ego or particular mental processes. And so you're actually in this, your non-conscious processes are out competing your conscious processes all day long just to keep your conscious processes from driving you off the cliff or steering you off the cliff, if you will. And so this, what Matthew was speaking about with consciousness, takes me to something that Michael said a little while ago in terms of thinking about collective intelligence and kind of critiquing the front-loaded way in which we're trying to achieve that, as if we could, and it's hard because you obviously did a very eloquent job of getting us there through explaining the tools, or through explaining the holes there in the logic. So I am going to jump away from that problem because I'm more interested in comparing this collective intelligence framework to what Matthew is talking about with artificial intelligence. And it's almost, to me, with computer programming, and I'm not a programmer or a coder or have no formal university training in this, but it seems to me that the idea of artificial intelligence is a misunderstanding of what consciousness is. It's focusing on the front-loading aspect of the ego, which you would use in psychology to talk about this, but specific mental processes. It's associating identity with that, the part that will steer us off the cliff, rather than the listening capacities and a kind of, I would say, trans-egoic consciousness, a fifth voice. I don't know. I'm making up language here. I don't have a specific word that I want to use to identify this because I'm hoping that I'm speaking through a few different discourses here.
I had shared something in the chat. There's a book that Bruce Schneier wrote called Liars and Outliers that does a really good job of outlining the tensions between the value that comes from us collaborating as a group, right? Mm-hmm. And the value that comes from me defecting and acting like a parasite on the group. And you never get perfect collaboration. And you never get perfect defection. Because there's a huge advantage to collaborating. And the advantage is simply that if each of those parties can optimize on doing a particular thing, and the others can benefit from that, then they each are good. There's this huge efficiency gain there, but there's also a resilience benefit there, right? One part of the system can sort of break, and that you can find an alternate path around the thing. But if you house all of those together into a single organism, that if it dies, it dies. Like there's a little bit less diversity, I guess. There's a huge advantage to diversity in any system, and I'll leave that there. So there's this obviously this advantage to collaboration, and at the same time, if everybody's collaborating and one bad actor shows up who's able to figure out how to just harvest without contributing, it harvests really well, and everything goes away. And when everything goes away, it dies. Right? So this sort of thing with, it would become only the bad actors. No, you never get to that, because then there's nothing nurturing the system. There's no continued life. Like that leads to a dead end. The collaborators, where they trust everybody at all times, that also leads to a dead end, because they get out of practice of defending against attackers. And so you have this fluctuating balance where you always have some attackers or defectors in your system. The key is not to get to a point where you have none. If you get to none, then you get out of practice for dealing with attackers. The key is to get to try to maintain a level of attack or defection that is low enough that it doesn't threaten the whole system. And again, what counts as the system is viewed from various perspectives. But I see a couple of hands raised. Francine, and then Sam.
I'm not sure how to say this, but I just wanted to kind of reframe, at least for me, attack is a little too narrow of a word, and that you'd like to have other people enter your system that are going to create some creative tension so your system can grow even into more of its wholeness. And so you need those seeds that are going to allow you to expand even more into the interrelationships that would even generate a more nurturing space. How's that?
That was wonderful. And I will say, from the perspective of the system, that is totally the case. From the perspective of the thing that got eaten, that may be less of a growth. But you're right, right? That's
actually, I have been knocked down a few times, more than I'd like to say, not almost destroyed. And I don't, when I've seen it as my own growth, that I had an area that I was a little bit blind to. And although from one perspective, it definitely felt like an attack. And from another perspective, I definitely have died. Something else did emerge. So, but it does take, I am one of those people who got too far out into the perceptive space and then wasn't functioning in a utility good enough. And I'm actually still there right now, but I trust myself enough to know that from this, something else is going to, if I do survive, it will be worth it. And if I don't survive, it was a good try. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Sam.
I really wanted to pick up on this theme of imperfect collaboration, because we have a recognition that collaboration is only good and can be specified or even can be carried through to a certain point. The problem we have is we've developed social structures to try and enforce better and better collaboration. And those enforcement mechanisms read attorneys, read contracts, read courts, eliminate the possibility that I can live with an imperfect understanding of what I want to do with you. Because there's always room for somebody else to come in and pathologically say, oh, well, there's this nth order effect that you didn't comply with, therefore, we're going to penalize you and we're going to extract some fees, and we're now going to take that part of the currency and put it into what I consider a less productive area of society, rather than the truly collaborative effort which we were trying to engage in to actually add value to society. And that overhead mechanism, that structure of enforcing the 17th or 18th degree minutia of collaboration prevents us from taking the first, second, third order approximation of what it is we want to do and focus just on doing that and say, that's good enough. I can't just write you a 3-line agreement, say, I'm going to give you $5,000 if we do this. You say, yes, let's go. Because somebody over there is going to say, well, geez, what if Sam gets run over by a bus tomorrow? Blah, 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 blah. There's going to be 50 other pages of crap I have to deal with. And that's the social overhead cost of not living with good enough. Over.
I have something to say on that, but I want to give other folks an opportunity to comment on any of these things, because I speak plenty. Rob or Topan or Reed, do any of you have, or John, do any of you have a comment? Or Tia?
Well, I can say something. I don't know if it exactly flows from what was just said, but what I was thinking earlier about the connection between the Hoffman paper and, say, Ceptr or MetaCurrency is, I guess, the idea that maybe seeing more of reality isn't exactly useful or contributing to your fitness in the environment, but that with maybe these tools, Ceptr, whatever, if we're then able to see more of a reality, but then actually make sense of it and make sense of that complexity, then it's not just a distraction. It's something we can kind of, it adds to our fitness function or whatever you want to call it.
I jotted a note to comment on that one too. Other folks?
I had a brief period on a ski hill and encountered some blind skiers. And so we started skiing blind to see how that worked. Worked a damn sight better than with our eyes open. Skied better. It was altogether a better matched system. And I think that's the issue, is that when you're skiing, you see something, it tends to interrupt your process in a way. And Ashby's law, requisite variety, what you're controlling and what you're controlling it with should be in the same range of complexity. And unfortunately, these systems are not. And I think that we're going to see as the virtual currencies expand into filling the space that conventional money does not. You know, there's a huge niche there. There's massive space. Then we're going to find out that this is crazy. And that's what makes it work. I mean, nature is wonderfully redundant, inefficient, self-defeating, creative. And we're in the same business. We're in the same process. It's just that we have to break out of the last 2,000-3,000 years of, you know, I don't know, stocks and assets, retained earnings. Hold on to your ass. That's got to go.
I see a raised hand from Sam, but anybody who hasn't really spoken much yet want to jump in? I see also a raised hand from Nicholas.
That was just a finger wave.
That means he likes what Michael said.
Give me the finger again then, Nick.
Sam.
Michael raised this issue of complexity, and Rebecca Costa, I guess I forget the name of her book, was talking about how many civilizations have come and gone because they haven't dealt with complexity. And it didn't need to take the form of either water or food or, you know, trees or whatever. It was just complexity in general. And I'm posing, I think, for this group, it's a question that I think is really our responsibility, which is, are we able to grow sufficiently as a civilization so that we can surpass the complexity that we've imposed on ourselves? And if we don't, then we're going to go the way of the Mayans, the Incans, you know, the Trojans, et cetera, and I'm struck by our arrogance by thinking that we have better tools and better technologies and better interaction than they did. Mm-hmm. You know, we don't really know that. But let's just take one case in point. You know, we think we have the internet. We don't know whether they had an internet-like technology or not, you know. But even if we do have such a powerful new tool as the internet, it's so empowering. What are the chances the first time we have it that we're going to use it correctly? Just like, how many times, do you actually have to wield the sword before you really knew how to wield the sword? And to think of the internet as a really powerful sword, are we just going to be babes in the woods, white belts out there raising this internet thing and hoping that we can do it correctly to save our society? There's a lot ahead of us that I think is our privilege and our responsibility to really deal with, even though we're coming up with new tools. Over.
Yeah, the parallel there is the printing press was originally an instrument for earning more money for the Catholic Church. And it took several centuries before actually literacy became functional. And the computer is just beginning to show up as a potentially enlightening device. It's been so much of it has just been business, armaments, money, marketing.
3-second aside, I have to say that Doug Engelbart showed us what we could do with it 48 years ago, and we haven't really paid attention, okay? That's why I, as a Doug disciple wannabe, really want to refocus on that theme. Okay?
Go with Doug.
Francine wrote a little comment in the note that I like and would like to share. Time and space are a construct we're using also. So we can't say for certain that the Mayan civilization no longer exists. We just don't see it in the time and space we find this version of ourselves operating in for this web talk. Yep. Let's see. I'm going to comment on something that I think Reed had said, Rob had said, about making sense. And I want to sort of talk about the MetaCurrency project just a little bit. So sensing and making sense. From my understanding of how all this stuff works, right? If you are, we talked about earlier, if you're sensitive to things that don't prove useful, you go away eventually. And if you're not sensitive to things that you should be in order to feed yourself and reproduce and not die, you go away. And that happens at different layers, right? If we as individuals are able to feed ourselves, but we're not able to coordinate in a way that enables our company to survive, if we're not able to find customers for our products, the company goes away. That organism, that organization goes away. And I guess the way I'll frame this is, when we look at communities that are small, we do a pretty good job, and I think that talking about the Mayans, is interesting. Although I think the Mayans were a pretty big civilization. Because they were big, they probably had some communication tools and communication breakdowns, like many big civilizations and organizations have. When you get to that large a size, you end up needing to use tools to distill the information down. So when you look at a 100,000 person company, most people would say, hey, those big companies end up being dysfunctional in specific ways. And the ways in which they're dysfunctional, I would say in general, are related to the fact that our individual brains aren't capable of handling all of that complexity. And so in order to operate at that size, we need to transform information in ways that synthesize it, that distill it down into smaller, less accurate, less whole translations so that other people can see what's going on. And one of the main tools that we use in the business world is balance sheets. We count dollars. And that helps upper management to see whether middle management's doing an okay job in a lot of contexts. That doesn't capture all of the things that are happening in the system. In fact, it loses a lot of things, and it ends up distorting perception, and it ends up distorting behavior within those organizations. And I think that's often why you end up seeing those big companies, after they get big, they last for a while and then they fall. And I think it is really very closely tied into this information processing at scale issue. The thing that and I don't know whether the Mayans had the internet or not, but I do know that we seem to have the internet. And I do think that we are not, as Sam had pointed out, I don't think we're using it right yet. And I don't think it even is right yet. And I don't think it's ever going to be quote unquote right. But the goal with the MetaCurrency project is to just make it work better, right? And we're actually not trying to build the one true system. We think that would be silly. We're trying to build a foundation that others can build on and can transform. They can transform the foundation itself. We're trying to just put a first useful piece of structure in place. And the way that we think about it is, you had mentioned the printing press, similar to the printing press, or more realistically, similar to the invention of writing, right? With the invention of writing, a community is suddenly able to communicate, to leave signals in a different way than it was previously. Even with the invention of pictures, the ability to write down a picture, right? That's different from if prior to being able to draw a picture. If you suddenly are able to write down words, letters, sounds, that gives you another advantage. And for us, we see those communication technologies as enabling collaboration within a community in ways that are much more complicated, in ways that work better, basically, that prove more useful over larger populations or over larger time scales. And at the same time, a lot of the previous innovations that gave communities these kind of collaborative advantages, often they created an efficiency gain that centralized decision-making power, right? And which meant they got this efficiency gain and had a real significant diversity or resilience cost. And the thing that I think is interesting with the internet and what Ceptr is trying to do is, hey, it's really cheap to do computational stuff. Take in one thing and perform an average calculation, like count a bunch of things and average them. That's cheap. And it's also pretty cheap to be able to look at 100 different things and decide to only use 30 of them and count those and only those, and to differentiate them from the others on some criteria. And so what we're trying to create is, and this is my take on it, is a set of tools that enable signal publication, signal subscription. So somebody's sharing something and somebody else is deciding, yeah, that's something I'll eat. Signal transformation. And I think oftentimes when you look at the natural world, but also in information systems, one of the main forms of transformation that we're interested in is synthesis. Hey, we took all this detail, all this complexity, and we distilled it down into something that is smaller and more easy to consume and thus act upon. And the simple example I'll give is Yelp reviews, right? People commenting on a restaurant. How good a restaurant was this? Well, there's been 1,000 people who've gone into this restaurant. They've each eaten there for an hour, and each of them has written, just put down a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5. And then there's another 1,000 people who've gone onto this other restaurant, and they've rated it as well. So all told, between those two restaurants, we've got 2,000 hours of human experience. If they've jotted all those things down and I presented all of those to you, well, let me just frame it this way. If you say, hey, how was it? And I say, yeah, I'd give it a 5 out of 5. Right? That gives you some kind of information. It didn't take you an hour to process that. I could give you a longer-winded example. But the beauty of the 5-point scale example is it's easy for you to combine that with the other 999 people. And if you combine it and just put that onto a sheet, that might actually not do you very much good. You could look at one sheet and it's got 1,000 different little numbers on it. And you look at another sheet and it has another 1,000 numbers on it. And you're like, I don't know. There's still too much information there. for you to actually be able to process quickly and act on. But if you average them, then suddenly you've got a 4.9 on the one piece of paper out of 1,000 reviews and a 2.7 out of 1,000, and it becomes much easier to decide which restaurant to go to. What's happened is you've taken all those signals, that 2,000 hours of human experience, and through a couple of steps, you've distilled it down into something that at a glance, you could decide which direction you want to turn and which action to take. With the MetaCurrency project, we recognize that we're not all going to agree about who to trust. We're not all going to agree about what's important. There are going to be attributes that some of us care about that others don't. You know, some of us who are wealthy are going to go, I don't care how much it is. And others of us who are not so wealthy are going to go, I really care how much it is. You know? And we're going to differ not only amongst individuals, but over time. If I just ate a burrito, I'm not all that interested in finding a burrito joint, right? It doesn't matter how cheap it is. But if I haven't eaten in 3 days, I want to know where a burrito joint is. We're trying to build a system that enables that kind of signaling flow. That's really what we're trying to do. And we think that there's important balances there around privacy, around sharing, around communication, and around how you can make it easy for people to translate one thing into another thing. And to simplify that translation process by helping them find signals from other folks about what would be a good tool to use for doing that translation. Right? And so essentially what we're trying to do at the MetaCurrency project is, as Rob had pointed out, we're trying to mimic biological systems, but we're trying to build information systems to support social systems, humans, in steering themselves more effectively. And effectively doesn't mean just efficiently. It includes the resilience part. It includes the diversity part. We need to be able to steer ourselves amidst disagreement, because Sam might want one thing and find one thing to be desirable, and I might find another. And the fact that we disagree is actually a good thing for our community as a whole, not a bad thing. And so that's how we look at it. We've got just a few minutes left. I see a couple of raised hands, Francine and Sam. Sam, I think I saw your hand get raised first.
Just a quick note. From an evolutionary sense, traditional currencies have lost information about the transaction that the currency was exchanged for. And it's an obvious step for those people working in metacurrencies, but if you can actually tie the currency to the actual details of the transaction, then you have a very, what I think is a necessary, maybe not sufficient, but a necessary step for establishment of trust. And trust is actually what allows us to go at that approximate specification for collaboration. If you don't have trust, that's where you need the 50-page contract, right? So by tying the details of the transaction back with the currency itself, allowing that trust to flow, I think is an evolutionary step, which has taken thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years in coming. But that's, I think, crucial. And I embody it in something that I call Wizzy Do. What I see is what I do, but, we can talk about this.
And I'm going to add to that just real quickly before I turn to Francine and just say, oh gosh, I just dropped it. I got fixated on the word trust, but it was the earlier part of what you had said that had triggered this for me. Oh yes, that type of transaction, hey, here's the synthesis and here's the raw material that synthesis drew upon, and here's the algorithm that it was synthesized with. That packaging and tying together is a really useful and important tool, and it should not be the only way to communicate. You should not have to give them all of those together, because sometimes part of your role is actually the masking of all that detail. And the reason that becomes important is you may not be willing to share that synthesis if you have to share all those root pieces. There may be some shame, there may be some threat, there may be, if I had to tell you where I got this from, then people could figure out who I was and they could punish me for it, right? All of those things become true in a system. And so yes, you have to have the ability to package them together, and that gives the consumers greater power. It puts them in a more empowered position. But it's not going to be the only way in which you can share. Francine.
Well, first, I think I have a addition. So I think Bitcoin is starting, at least in, isn't that the BitChain technology?
Blockchain.
Blockchain technology is helping, at least for us, to tie some of those information. And that actually technology, we can add a lot of, not just in currency, but in other digital products, we can add a lot of information into it. So I just learned about blockchain recently, and I was like, oh my God, I'm so excited that I watched this. There's several great videos out there. And then my heart raised up when what you were talking about, Matt. I do think that our first step is to look at how nature has done it. So the biomimicry is definitely a good first step. But to bring in more of Don Hoffman's idea, as consciousness, we're actually creating, in time and space, new physiological processes. So when we will get new symbols of physiological form, when we have defined the function of what we're looking for. So I think it's a combination of all of that, and I just wanted to add that it's not just looking in one direction, that we actually have to look in a whole direction for ourselves, and that what we're actually looking to create and function, then the form kind of falls out in many different varieties. I think I'll stop there.
That was beautiful and wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Michael.
Yeah, just a sort of maybe a courtesy announcement. I put a link in the chat a few minutes ago to openmoney.gift and net.openmoney.gift, which are not alpha and alpha. We're letting you know about this stuff before it's really there. But if anybody's interested in that, basically peer-to-peer virtual currency sets, please be in touch. Thank you. There's been a really fascinating conversation.
Wonderful. We're going to be doing these every first and third Saturday of the month. So would love to have you participate, and would love to have any of your friends, all of you. If you have other people that you think would be really fun to collaborate with, or interesting to chat with, or who bring a different perspective, if it's just, this is dumb, that's okay. If you have a way that it's dumb, that might be interesting. But please bring good people. I think Rob, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of share one curiosity of mine. Assuming if we had Ceptr and these tools as infrastructure already waiting for us, and we identify that we don't just want to see everything of reality all at once, we sort of need to pick and choose what of that of which that we're not seeing to now expose in some way. Maybe the things that don't lend themselves to being reduced to a money or number or something, then yeah, I'm just curious what would be the kind of first things we start exposing that we think would be useful as new flows. So just as a sort of question or curiosity.
Yeah. I think that we could, because we are at 11:04 and I do want to be mindful of people's time, I would love to dive into that conversation maybe next time. If you guys have any suggestions about topics or things to talk about in these, please send them to me. I'm on Facebook, Matthew Schutte. Really looking forward to doing more of this. Any last comments before we wrap up? Going once, going twice. Oh, Francine, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Really looking forward to more of these. And at this point, this conversation is going to be, we're going to be recording these. We are going to be sharing them. If you have suggestions on how to do these things better, we're probably going to try some different structures. We may play some games. We may do some breakout groups, depending on how large the conversations get. Sam, you got to raise your hand.
I just wanted to bring to awareness a couple of other possible forums. In Palo Alto on Wednesday nights, twice or three times a month, there is a hosted conversation called Serious Conversations that tries to take what people really care about and bring it into kind of an hour and a half format. And that is either in Los Altos or Redwood City or Palo Alto. I just want to let people know about that.
And how can we get the details on that?
Contact either Bill Dahl or myself or Douglas Carmichael. Those are the people that are most connected to that particular group. Okay. And then secondly, because I'm a Engelbart wannabe, disciple wannabe, I have gathered a group of, let's say, 6 to 8 friends who have conversations at 6 a.m. Pacific time, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays. And these are people in Norway, Argentina, Denver, Seattle, Argentina, etc. And we have a number of different conversations underway, but all towards collective IQ and impact of the planet and how we evolve tool systems and human systems and how we interact with each other. And out of that has come a notion called the community of impact that I would love to talk to some of you about. And of course, this field that I and others are trying to further, which is called collaborology, which we define as the successful scaling of how we become more collectively smart and intelligent. Anyway, just wanted to put that in people's minds.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just realized that I had been sharing some things in the chat, but all of them were shared only to Rob because I had accidentally clicked on his name earlier. I will edit that. I will share the chat. We'll post this all up. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Tia.